The artillery opened fire before dawn. February 17, 1979. 600 kilometers of border lit up at once. Tanks rumbled south from Guangxi and Yunnan. 200,000 Chinese soldiers poured across the line into Vietnam. The invasion had begun. But to understand why communist was killing communist, you have to go back 4 years, back to Saigon falling, to the last helicopters lifting off the embassy roof, to a superpower limping home in defeat. Vietnam had done the impossible. They had driven out the French, survived the Americans, and reunified their country under one flag. And then, just 4 years later, another invasion came. Not from the West, from the North, from China. The stated reason was punishment. Vietnam had overthrown the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, Beijing's brutal ally. Hanoi had signed a treaty of friendship with the Soviet Union, China's communist rival. And Vietnam, in China's eyes, had grown arrogant with victory. They had forgotten their place. Beijing called it a self-defense counterattack. History would call it something else entirely. The betrayal was staggering. China had supported Vietnam through decades of anti-colonial struggle. Chinese advisors had helped train Viet Minh guerrillas. Chinese ports had received North Vietnamese weapons. Mao Zedong himself had proclaimed that the two nations were as close as lips and teeth. Revolutions make strange bedfellows. Victory changes everything. By 1978, the lips were snarling. The teeth were bared. The initial objective was simple: seize 3 provincial capitals in northern Vietnam. Destroy the infrastructure that had been built with Chinese aid over 20 years. Teach Hanoi a lesson it would not forget. The Chinese leadership expected a quick campaign. They believed Vietnamese forces were tied down in Cambodia. They believed their own numerical superiority would overwhelm what remained. They were wrong. Vietnam did not collapse. Instead, they did what they had always done. They melted into the terrain. They fought from tunnels and bunkers. They used the same tactics that had exhausted the French at Dien Bien Phu. They used the same tactics that had broken the American will to fight. Small units harassed Chinese supply lines. Snipers picked off officers. Mines and booby traps turned every road into a potential graveyard. The Chinese advance had looked unstoppable on paper. On the ground, it slowed to a bloody crawl. The fighting was savage. Both sides had learned their trade in the same school of revolutionary warfare. Now they turned those lessons against each other. Chinese troops, many of them poorly trained conscripts from northern provinces, found themselves in a nightmare landscape. Limestone karsts, dense jungle. Vietnamese militia units, some of them veterans of the American War, fought with grim familiarity. They knew these hills. They had built these fortifications, and they were defending their homes again. At Lang Son, the battle became a symbol of the entire war. The city sat astride the main highway to Hanoi. Just 140 kilometers from the capital, Chinese forces attacked it for days. They took heavy casualties in house-to-house fighting. When they finally captured it in early March, they found a ruined city and an empty victory. Vietnamese defenders had withdrawn in good order. They left behind booby traps, and they left behind a message scrawled on walls: "We will be back." 3 weeks into the invasion, Beijing declared its objectives achieved. They announced a withdrawal. The troops pulled back. The border fell quiet, but nothing had been settled. The cost was enormous. Both sides deliberately obscured it. China admitted to 20,000 casualties. Independent estimates suggest the real figure was closer to 26,000 dead, 37,000 wounded. Vietnamese losses were never fully disclosed. They were certainly in the tens of thousands. The border region was devastated. Towns were flattened. Infrastructure built over 2 decades of Chinese aid was systematically destroyed by Chinese hands. The lesson Beijing intended to teach had been delivered with explosives and fire. The student had not learned what China wanted. The geopolitical fallout was immediate and lasting. Vietnam did not withdraw from Cambodia. Instead, they occupied the country for another decade. They toppled the Khmer Rouge. They installed a puppet government. The Soviet Union, bound by treaty, did not intervene militarily. They moved warships into the South China Sea. They increased aid to Hanoi. The United States, still licking its wounds from Vietnam, watched from the sidelines with quiet satisfaction. 2 communist powers were tearing at each other. China had wanted to demonstrate its strength. Instead, it had exposed its limitations. The military lessons were equally harsh. Chinese forces had fought with outdated equipment. Their tactics were frozen in the Korean War era. Command structures were rigid. Coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery was poor. Logistics broke down repeatedly. The People's Liberation Army had not fought a major war in 25 years. Its officers were political appointees. Its soldiers were peasants with rifles. Against battle-hardened Vietnamese veterans, they paid a steep price for every kilometer gained. For Vietnam, the war hardened a siege mentality that persists today. They had defeated the French. They had defeated the Americans. Now they had fought China to a standstill. But the cost was exhaustion. The economy was shattered. The population was war-weary, and the border remained a permanent threat. Vietnamese leaders understood they would always face a powerful northern neighbor. That neighbor had historical claims on their territory. The alliance with the Soviet Union provided temporary security. It also locked Hanoi into a Cold War alignment. That alignment would become a liability when the Soviet Empire collapsed. The Sino-Vietnamese War also revealed the fragility of communist solidarity. Ideology had not prevented this bloodshed. Shared revolutionary struggle had not created permanent friendship. National interest, territorial ambition, and ancient rivalry had overridden everything. The war was a continuation of 1,000 years of Chinese domination and Vietnamese resistance. Now, it was dressed in Marxist language. The uniforms were different, the flags were red, but the dynamic was ancient. And then, the world moved on. The Iranian Revolution, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the intensifying Cold War between Washington and Moscow, all of it pushed a 3-week border war to the margins of memory. No Hollywood films were made, no best-selling books were written. It became a forgotten war. It was fought between two nations that the West had spent decades trying to contain. The paradox was complete, but the consequences endured. Vietnam stayed in Cambodia for another decade. They maintained their occupation despite Chinese threats. China embarked on a massive military modernization program, determined never again to suffer such embarrassment. New weapons, new training, new doctrine. Even today, the South China Sea disputes and the underlying historical tensions trace their roots to this brief, brutal conflict. So what happened when China invaded Vietnam in 1979? Beijing learned that numerical superiority means nothing against an enemy fighting for survival on familiar ground. Hanoi learned that victory against superpowers does not guarantee security against neighbors. And the world learned, though it quickly forgot, that the aftermath of war is never clean. The Vietnamese had defeated the Americans, but there was no peace waiting for them. There was only another war, another invasion, another round of suffering in a land that had known little else for a generation. The last Chinese soldiers crossed back into their country in late March 1979. Behind them lay scorched earth and uncounted dead. Ahead of them lay a future of economic transformation and military reinvention. Vietnam turned south again, toward Cambodia, toward reconstruction, toward a slow and painful recovery. The border fell quiet, the wounds remained, and the war that both sides claimed to have won slipped into the shadows of history, waiting to be remembered.